Commander Jake Morrison had seen everything in his 22 years as a Navy SEAL. He had jumped from helicopters into enemy territory, fought in the mountains of Afghanistan, and led rescue missions in the most dangerous places on Earth. Nothing surprised him anymore, or so he thought. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Veterans Affairs Hospital in San Diego as Jake walked toward the entrance. He wasn't there as a patient. Today he was visiting wounded warriors from his last mission in Syria. 3 of his men had been injured when their convoy hit an improvised explosive device, and Jake made it his personal duty to check on every soldier under his command. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and the familiar smell of disinfectant filled his nostrils. Jake had been to many military hospitals over the years, but he never got used to the mixture of hope and sadness that seemed to hang in the air like invisible fog. Commander Morrison, a young nurse with kind eyes, approached him at the reception desk. "Your men are doing much better today. Sergeant Williams is even walking around a bit." Jake nodded, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. He had been carrying the weight of that mission for weeks. As the commanding officer, every injury to his team felt personal. The explosion had happened so fast that there was nothing anyone could have done differently, but that didn't stop Jake from replaying every detail in his mind. He made his way through the sterile corridors, his boots clicking against the polished floor. The walls were lined with photographs of veterans from different wars, their faces telling stories of courage and sacrifice. Jake recognized some of the uniforms from different eras: World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, and the more recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Room 312 was his first stop. Sergeant Williams was indeed walking around, much to Jake's relief. The young soldier's leg was still bandaged, but his spirits seemed high as he joked with the other patients. They talked for nearly an hour about everything except the mission. Sometimes, Jake had learned, the best medicine was simply pretending things were normal. His next visit was to Corporal Rodriguez in room 318. The young Marine had suffered a concussion and some shrapnel wounds, but the doctors said he would make a full recovery. Rodriguez was from a small town in Texas, and he spent most of their conversation talking about his girlfriend back home and their plans to get married when he returned. Jake's final visit was to Private First Class Thompson in room 325. Thompson was the youngest member of their unit, barely 21 years old. He had joined the military straight out of high school, following in his father's footsteps. The explosion had damaged his hearing, and the doctors weren't sure if it would fully return. Thompson tried to stay positive, but Jake could see the worry in his eyes. After spending time with each of his men, Jake felt emotionally drained. These visits were necessary, but they always reminded him of the human cost of their missions. He decided to take a walk through the hospital's garden area before heading back to base. The garden was a peaceful space designed specifically for patients and their families. There were benches scattered among carefully maintained flower beds, and a small fountain provided a soothing background sound. Jake found an empty bench and sat down, needing a few minutes to collect his thoughts. That's when he noticed the old man sitting on a bench about 20 feet away. The man appeared to be in his 70s with white hair and weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. He was wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, nothing that would immediately identify him as a veteran. But something about the way he carried himself, the straight posture despite his age, suggested military service. Jake had always been good at reading people. It was a skill that had served him well throughout his military career. This old man had the bearing of someone who had once worn a uniform with pride. There was a quiet dignity about him, the kind that came from facing difficult situations and emerging stronger. The old man seemed lost in thought, staring at the fountain with distant eyes. Jake wondered what memories might be playing in his mind. Every veteran carried stories. Some they shared freely, and others they kept locked away in the deepest corners of their hearts. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, and Jake noticed the old man's shirt sleeve had shifted slightly. That's when he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. On the man's forearm, partially visible beneath the fabric, was the edge of what appeared to be a tattoo. Jake's heart began to race, though he couldn't immediately understand why. There was something familiar about the design, something that triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. He found himself staring, trying to get a better look without being obvious about it. The old man must have sensed someone watching him because he turned and made eye contact with Jake. His eyes were a sharp blue, alert despite his age. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the garden. The old man's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that suggested he too was sizing up the younger man. Jake nodded politely, the kind of acknowledgement one veteran gives to another. The old man returned the nod, but his expression remained serious. He seemed to be studying Jake's uniform, taking note of the SEAL insignia and rank indicators. The wind picked up again, and this time the old man's sleeve shifted more dramatically. Jake got a clearer view of the tattoo, and what he saw made him feel like he had been punched in the stomach. The design was unmistakable, even though he was seeing only a portion of it. His hands began to tremble slightly, and he gripped the edge of the bench to steady himself. Memories came flooding back, memories he had tried to bury for years. Images flashed through his mind like scenes from a movie played at high speed. The tattoo design was connected to something from his past, something he had thought was long dead and buried. Jake tried to remain calm, but his mind was racing. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet there was no denying what he was seeing. After all these years in a random veterans' hospital garden, he had stumbled upon something that could change everything he thought he knew about his own history. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. The tattoo on the old man's arm featured a distinctive design that he recognized from classified briefings years ago. It was a symbol that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, connected to operations that had been erased from official records. The old man noticed Jake's intense stare and slowly rolled up his sleeve, revealing the complete tattoo. It was a black eagle with spread wings clutching a lightning bolt in its talons. Beneath it were numbers that Jake recognized as coordinates, and below that, a single word in Latin that made his stomach clench with anxiety. Jake had only seen this design once before, in a classified intelligence file during his early days as a SEAL. The file had detailed a covert military unit that operated during the Vietnam War, conducting missions so secret that most of their operations were never officially recorded. The unit had been disbanded decades ago, and all records were supposedly destroyed. The old man stood up slowly, his movements careful but deliberate. He walked toward Jake with the measured pace of someone who had made a decision. As he approached, Jake could see more details that confirmed his growing suspicions. The man's posture, the way he scanned the area before sitting down, the subtle signs of someone who had been trained to always be aware of his surroundings. "You're looking at my ink like you recognize it, son," the old man said, his voice gravelly but strong. He sat down on the bench next to Jake without asking permission, the way someone might who was used to taking charge of situations. Jake tried to keep his expression neutral, but years of military training couldn't completely hide his shock. "I might have seen something similar in some old military history books," he replied carefully, not wanting to reveal how much he actually knew. The old man chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "Military history books don't usually cover the kind of work that earned me this tattoo, Commander Morrison." Jake's blood turned to ice. The old man knew his name despite the fact that they had never met. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. Someone had arranged for this meeting, though Jake couldn't begin to guess who or why. "You seem to know more about me than I know about you," Jake said, shifting into the alert mindset that had kept him alive through countless dangerous missions. "Name's Frank Sullivan," the old man said, extending a weathered hand. "Master Sergeant retired. Though my service record would tell you I spent most of my time pushing papers at a supply depot in Da Nang." Jake shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that suggested Frank's real military service had been far more demanding than managing supplies. "And what would your service record be leaving out, Master Sergeant?" Frank's blue eyes grew distant as if he were looking through Jake rather than at him. Things that needed doing but couldn't be officially sanctioned. Operations that saved American lives but violated international law. Missions that were necessary for the war effort but couldn't appear in any government report. The weight of Frank's words settled over Jake like a heavy blanket. He was talking about black ops, the kind of military operations that existed in the shadows between official policy and battlefield necessity. Jake had been part of similar missions himself, operations that would never appear in his official service record. "Why are you telling me this?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Frank pulled a folded photograph from his wallet and handed it to Jake. It was old and faded, showing a group of young soldiers in jungle camouflage. They looked to be in their early 20s, their faces serious but confident. Jake studied the photo, noting the lack of any identifying unit patches or insignia. "That was my team in 1971, Frank said quietly. "We called ourselves Ghost Unit, though that name never appeared in any official documents. We specialized in deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence that conventional forces couldn't access." Jake continued studying the photograph, trying to understand why Frank was sharing this information with him. Then he noticed something that made his hands tremble slightly. One of the young soldiers in the photo looked remarkably familiar, despite the 40-year age difference. "The young man standing third from the left," Frank continued, pointing to a specific soldier in the photo. "That's Tommy Morrison. Good soldier. Never complained about the dangerous assignments. Always volunteered for the worst missions." Jake's world tilted on its axis. Morrison was his last name and Tommy was his father's name. His father, who had died when Jake was only 8 years old, supposedly in a training accident at Fort Bragg. His father, who had never talked about his service in Vietnam, claiming he had spent his deployment working in communications. "That's impossible," Jake whispered, though even as he said it, he could see the resemblance between himself and the young soldier in the photograph. "My father never served in combat. He was a communications specialist." Frank's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Son, your father was one of the bravest soldiers I ever served with. He saved my life more times than I can count, and he paid a price for his service that went far beyond what any man should have to bear." Jake's mind was reeling. Everything he thought he knew about his father's military service was apparently a lie. The man he remembered as a quiet, gentle father who worked on base and died in a routine training accident had actually been a member of an elite covert unit conducting dangerous missions in Vietnam. "Why wasn't I told the truth?" Jake asked, though his voice sounded strange and distant to his own ears. "Because the truth was classified at levels that don't officially exist," Frank replied. "Because your father and the rest of us were involved in operations that the government needed to deny. Because sometimes the cost of serving your country includes having your sacrifice go unrecognized." Frank reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small metal object. It was a military challenge coin, but unlike any Jake had ever seen. Instead of unit insignia, it bore the same eagle and lightning bolt design as Frank's tattoo, along with coordinates and a date from 1971. "Your father carried this coin on every mission," Frank said, placing it in Jake's palm. "He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would find his family and tell them the truth about his service. It took me longer than I hoped to track you down, but I'm a man of my word." Jake stared at the challenge coin, feeling its weight in his hand. It was solid and real, proof that this conversation wasn't some elaborate hallucination brought on by stress from his recent mission. His father had been a hero in ways Jake had never known, and that knowledge was both thrilling and devastating. "What happened to him?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Frank's face grew grim. "That's a story for another conversation, son. What I can tell you right now is that your father's death wasn't the accident you were told it was, and the people responsible might not be finished with the Morrison family." The weight of Frank's words hit Jake like a physical blow. His father's death hadn't been an accident. For 34 years, Jake had lived with the story that his father died during a routine training exercise when a piece of equipment malfunctioned. Now he was learning that everything about that story was a lie. "What do you mean they might not be finished?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands were shaking now, and he gripped the challenge coin tighter, feeling its edges bite into his palm. Frank looked around the garden carefully, his old soldier instinct still sharp after all these years. "Let's take a walk," he suggested, standing up slowly. "Some conversations are better had while moving." They walked toward a more secluded part of the garden where tall hedges provided privacy from other visitors. Frank moved with the careful gait of an older man, but Jake could see traces of the soldier he had once been in the way he positioned himself to keep watch on their surroundings. "Your father discovered something during our last mission in Vietnam," Frank began, his voice low and serious. "We had been sent to gather intelligence on North Vietnamese supply routes, but what we found was much bigger than enemy troop movements." Jake listened intently as they walked along a gravel path lined with rose bushes. The peaceful setting felt surreal given the explosive nature of what Frank was revealing. There was a group of American officials who were secretly working with enemy forces, Frank continued. They were providing information about U.S. military operations in exchange for financial benefits and political favors. Your father uncovered documents that proved this conspiracy went all the way to Washington. The implications of what Frank was saying began to sink in. Jake's father hadn't just been a soldier conducting reconnaissance missions. He had discovered evidence of treason at the highest levels of government. Tommy made copies of everything, Frank said, stopping near a small memorial bench dedicated to fallen veterans. He was planning to turn the evidence over to military intelligence when we got back to base. But someone found out what he had discovered. Jake felt sick to his stomach. Someone killed him to keep him quiet. Frank nodded grimly. The official story was that he died in a training accident 2 weeks after we returned from Vietnam. But I knew Tommy better than anyone. He was too careful, too experienced to die in a routine training exercise. Someone wanted him dead, and they made it look like an accident. They sat down on the memorial bench and Jake tried to process everything he was learning. His father had been a hero who died trying to expose traitors. The knowledge filled him with pride and rage in equal measure. Why didn't you come forward with this information back then? Jake asked. Frank's expression grew darker. I tried. I went to our commanding officer, but he told me the investigation was classified and that I needed to keep quiet. When I pushed harder, I started receiving threats. Someone broke into my apartment and left a message that I would end up like Tommy if I didn't forget what I thought I knew. Jake could see the pain in Frank's eyes as he recalled those events. So you stayed quiet to protect yourself. I stayed quiet to protect my family, Frank corrected. I had a wife and 2 young children. The people who killed your father made it clear that my family would be next if I caused any trouble. So I kept my mouth shut and spent the next 40 years living with the guilt. The anger was building in Jake's chest like pressure in a steam boiler. Not only had his father been murdered, but the man who could have sought justice had been forced into silence through threats against his family. What changed? Jake asked. Why are you telling me this now? Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. Because last month I received this in my mailbox. No return address, no explanation. Just these documents and a note saying it was time for the truth to come out. Jake opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were photocopies of military documents, photographs, and what appeared to be decoded radio transmissions. As he flipped through the papers, he could see his father's name mentioned multiple times, along with references to sensitive intelligence and security breach containment. One document made his blood run cold. It was a memo dated 3 days before his father's death, discussing necessary measures to protect ongoing operations and eliminating security risks. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Someone had ordered his father's assassination. This is evidence of murder, Jake said, his voice tight with controlled fury. Why haven't you taken this to the authorities? Frank laughed bitterly. Son, some of the people mentioned in those documents are still alive. Some of them hold powerful positions in government and business. Do you really think local police or even the FBI would be able to pursue justice against people with that kind of influence? Jake continued reading through the documents, his military training helping him understand the significance of what he was seeing. The conspiracy his father had uncovered wasn't just about selling information to the enemy. It involved systematic corruption that had continued for decades after the Vietnam War ended. Someone wants this information to come to light, Jake said, thinking out loud. Otherwise, why would they send it to you after all these years? That's what I've been wondering, Frank replied, and why I sought you out. Maybe whoever sent this knows that you're in a position to do something about it. You're a Navy SEAL commander with security clearance and connections throughout the military intelligence community. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had spent his entire adult life serving his country, following orders and trusting in the system. Now he was being asked to consider the possibility that the system itself was corrupt, that his father had died because he tried to expose that corruption. There's something else, Frank said, his voice even more serious than before. 2 days after I received that envelope, someone broke into my house. Nothing was stolen, but my bedroom had been searched thoroughly. I think whoever killed your father knows that the truth is starting to come out. Jake's mind immediately jumped to tactical considerations. If Frank was being watched, then their meeting might have been observed. If the conspiracy was as far-reaching as these documents suggested, then both of their lives could be in danger. "We need to assume you're being monitored," Jake said, his military training taking over. "From this moment forward, we need to be extremely careful about how we communicate and where we meet." Frank smiled for the first time since they had started talking. "I was hoping you would say that, son, because I think your father would want you to finish what he started, and I think whoever sent me these documents is counting on you to do exactly that." Jake looked at the challenge coin in his hand, then at the documents that proved his father had died a hero's death. The peaceful garden around them suddenly felt like a war zone, and Jake realized that his most dangerous mission was just beginning. Jake spent the next 3 days studying every document Frank had given him. He spread them across his kitchen table in his small apartment off base, creating a timeline that painted a picture of corruption so extensive it made him question everything he thought he knew about military service. The evidence showed that his father's unit had stumbled upon a network of American officials who were not only selling intelligence to North Vietnamese forces, but also profiting from black market weapons sales and drug trafficking. The operation had generated millions of dollars over several years, with money flowing to conspirators in the Pentagon, CIA, and even Congress. Jake's father had been methodical in gathering evidence. He had photographed documents, recorded conversations, and even obtained bank records showing suspicious financial transactions. The level of detail suggested he had been working on the investigation for months before his death. What troubled Jake most was realizing how sophisticated the cover-up had been. His father's death had been staged to look like an equipment malfunction during a routine training exercise. The investigation had been brief and superficial, conducted by officers who were likely part of the conspiracy. Even the funeral arrangements had been handled in a way that discouraged questions or close examination of the circumstances. On Wednesday evening, Jake's secure phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Admiral Patricia Hayes, his direct supervisor at Naval Special Warfare Command. Admiral Hayes was one of the few people in the military that Jake trusted completely. But even that trust was being tested by what he had learned about his father's death. "Commander Morrison, I need to see you in my office tomorrow morning at 800, Admiral Hayes said without preamble. Her voice carried an unusual tension that immediately put Jake on alert. "Yes, ma'am. May I ask what this concerns?" There was a long pause before Admiral Hayes responded. "We'll discuss it tomorrow, Commander." "And Jake? Be careful who you trust right now." The line went dead, leaving Jake staring at his phone with growing concern. Admiral Hayes had never used his first name in an official conversation, and her warning about trust suggested she knew something about his recent activities. Jake couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about Frank's warning that the people responsible for his father's death might not be finished with the Morrison family. If Admiral Hayes had somehow learned about his investigation, it could mean that the conspiracy had tentacles reaching into current military leadership. The next morning, Jake arrived at Admiral Hayes' office 15 minutes early. Her secretary, an efficient young petty officer named Collins, seemed nervous as he announced Jake's arrival. Instead of the usual friendly greeting, Collins barely made eye contact and spoke, in a formal tone that suggested he had been instructed to maintain strict protocol. Admiral Hayes' office was on the 3rd floor of a building that housed the most senior officers of Naval Special Warfare Command. The walls were lined with photographs of successful SEAL operations and commendations from grateful foreign governments. Jake had been in this office dozens of times over the years, but today it felt different, almost hostile. "Close the door and have a seat, Commander," Admiral Hayes said as Jake entered. She was sitting behind her desk, but instead of her usual relaxed posture, she sat ramrod straight with her hands folded in front of her. Jake noticed immediately that Admiral Hayes wasn't alone. 2 men in dark suits were standing near the window, their positioning suggesting they were federal agents of some kind. Neither of them was introduced, and they remained silent as Jake took his seat. "Commander Morrison," Admiral Hayes began, her voice carefully neutral, "it has come to our attention that you have been in contact with individuals who may be involved in activities that could compromise national security." Jake felt his heart rate increase, but years of training helped him maintain his composure. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Admiral." One of the men in suits stepped forward. He was tall and thin, with gray hair and cold eyes that suggested he was accustomed to getting answers to his questions. "Commander, 3 days ago you met with Frank Sullivan. a former Army sergeant with connections to certain classified operations from the Vietnam era. The fact that they knew about his meeting with Frank confirmed Jake's worst fears. He was being watched, and the people doing the watching had resources that suggested government involvement. Frank Sullivan is a veteran receiving medical care at the VA hospital. Jake replied carefully. I spoke with him briefly in the hospital garden. I wasn't aware that talking to veterans was considered a security risk. The second agent, a shorter man with dark hair and a slight accent that Jake couldn't place, opened a folder and placed several photographs on Admiral Hayes' desk. They were surveillance photos of Jake and Frank sitting on the bench in the hospital garden. Mr. Sullivan is not just any veteran, Commander, the dark-haired agent said. He was a member of an unofficial military unit that conducted illegal operations during the Vietnam War. His recent contact with you has raised concerns about what information he may have shared. Jake realized he was walking into a trap. These agents already knew what Frank had told him, which meant they had either been monitoring their conversation or Frank himself was working with them. The possibility that Frank was part of the conspiracy made Jake feel sick to his stomach. I understand your concern, Jake said, choosing his words carefully, but our conversation was limited to general discussion about military service. Mr. Sullivan seemed to be dealing with some difficult memories from his time in Vietnam. Admiral Hayes leaned forward, her expression showing genuine concern for the first time since Jake had entered the office. Jake, I've known you for 8 years. You're one of the finest officers I've ever worked with, and I've always trusted your judgment completely. That's why I'm going to ask you directly. Has Frank Sullivan given you any documents or other materials related to military operations from the 1970s? The question hung in the air like a bomb with a slowly burning fuse. Jake realized that his answer would determine not just his own future, but possibly his life. If he admitted to having the documents, he would be confirming that he possessed evidence of a conspiracy that had already resulted in at least one murder. If he lied, he would be betting his career and freedom on his ability to investigate the truth without being caught. Jake looked directly at Admiral Hayes, trying to read her expression for any hint about what she really wanted him to say. Her eyes showed concern, but also something else that might have been fear. Admiral, Jake said slowly, I think there are some things about my father's death that I need to understand better, and I think there are people who don't want me to find those answers. The tall agent stepped forward again, his movement aggressive enough to suggest that Jake's response was not what they had hoped to hear. Commander Morrison, I strongly advise you to reconsider any investigation into matters that are classified above your security level. Some secrets are kept classified for very good reasons. Jake stood up, his decision made. With respect, sir, my father died serving this country. If there's more to that story than I've been told, I have a right to know the truth. Admiral Hayes also stood, her face showing a mixture of admiration and concern. Commander, you're being given an opportunity to walk away from this situation without consequences. I hope you'll consider that opportunity very carefully. As Jake left the office, he realized that his investigation had just become infinitely more dangerous. The conspiracy wasn't just about events from 40 years ago. It was still active, still powerful enough to monitor Navy SEALs and intimidate senior military officers. His father had died trying to expose these people, and now they knew that Jake was following in his footsteps. Jake left Admiral Hayes' office knowing that his life had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a Navy SEAL following orders. He was now a target of the same conspiracy that had killed his father. The warning from the federal agents had been clear: drop the investigation or face consequences. But Jake had inherited more than just his father's name. He had inherited his sense of duty and his refusal to back down when confronting injustice. As he walked to his car, Jake made a decision that would have made his father proud. He was going to find the truth no matter what it cost him. His first priority was ensuring his own safety. Jake's apartment was almost certainly being monitored now, which meant he couldn't return there. Instead, he drove to a safe house that his SEAL team used for emergency situations. It was a small cabin about an hour outside San Diego, stocked with communications equipment and weapons that weren't tracked by official military inventory. Once he was secure, Jake called Frank using an encrypted satellite phone. The old veteran answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting for the call. They know about our meeting, Jake said without preamble. I figured they would, Frank replied calmly. I've been watching my house for the past 2 days. Black SUV with tinted windows has been parked across the street since Tuesday morning. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Frank, I think we're both in serious danger. These people killed my father to protect their secret, and they won't hesitate to do the same to us. Son, I've been living with that knowledge for 40 years, Frank said. The difference is that now I'm old enough that I don't much care what happens to me. But you've got your whole life ahead of you, and a career worth protecting. My career doesn't mean anything if I can't live with myself, Jake replied. My father died trying to expose traitors. I'm not going to let his sacrifice be meaningless. There was a long pause before Frank spoke again. All right then. But if we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. These people have resources we can't match, but they also have weaknesses we can exploit. Frank explained that he had spent decades thinking about how to expose the conspiracy safely. The key was finding someone in a position of authority who wasn't part of the network and who had the power to act on the evidence. There's a journalist named Sarah Chen who works for the Washington Post, Frank said. She's been investigating military corruption for years, and she's built a reputation for protecting her sources. I think she might be our best option. Jake knew the name. Sarah Chen had broken several major stories about defense contractor fraud and Pentagon waste. More importantly, she had never revealed the identity of her sources, even when threatened with jail time. How do we contact her without being detected? Jake asked. Frank had thought about that too. There's a veteran support group that meets every Thursday evening at a community center in Oceanside. Sarah Chen's brother is a veteran, and he sometimes attends those meetings. If we can get to him, we might be able to arrange a meeting with his sister. It was a long shot, but it was better than trying to contact a major journalist directly while under government surveillance. Jake agreed to meet Frank at the community center the following evening. Thursday came faster than Jake expected. He spent the day monitoring radio traffic and checking for any signs that his location had been discovered. The safe house remained secure, but Jake knew that his pursuers were professional and patient. They would find him eventually. The community center in Oceanside was a modest building that hosted various local groups and activities. The Veterans Support Group met in a small room on the second floor, and Jake could hear conversation and occasional laughter as he approached the building. Frank was waiting in the parking lot, looking more nervous than Jake had ever seen him. I've been thinking about this all day, the old veteran said. Once we talk to that journalist, there's no going back. These people will know that we're serious about exposing them. They already know that, Jake replied. The question is whether we're going to let them intimidate us into silence the way they did 40 years ago. They entered the building together and climbed the stairs to the meeting room. About 20 veterans were seated in a circle, ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s. The conversation stopped as Jake and Frank entered, and several people looked at them with the natural suspicion that veterans often showed toward newcomers. The group leader, a middle-aged woman named Barbara, welcomed them warmly and invited them to join the circle. Jake scanned the faces around the room, looking for someone who might be Sarah Chen's brother. Frank had described him as a Marine veteran in his 40s who had served in Iraq. About halfway through the meeting, Jake spotted a man who fit the description. He was Asian American, with the bearing of a former Marine and scars on his hands that suggested combat experience. When the man introduced himself as David Chen, Jake knew they had found their target. After the meeting ended, Jake and Frank approached David Chen carefully. They explained that they were veterans dealing with some difficult information about military corruption and that they needed to speak with his sister about exposing the truth. David was immediately suspicious. My sister gets approached by a lot of people with stories about military wrongdoing, he said. Most of them are either conspiracy theorists or people looking to make money from fake scandals. Frank pulled out one of the documents from the envelope he had received. It was a photograph of his old unit in Vietnam, with names and dates written on the back. This isn't about making money or promoting theories, he said quietly. This is about good soldiers who died to protect secrets that should never have been kept. David studied the photograph and the accompanying documentation. His expression changed as he realized the significance of what he was seeing. These are official military documents from classified operations, he said. Documents that prove American officials were working with enemy forces during the Vietnam War, Jake added. and that they murdered soldiers who tried to expose the conspiracy. David looked around the now empty meeting room, making sure they weren't being overheard. If what you're saying is true, then my sister will definitely want to investigate. But she'll need more than just documents. She'll need witnesses and corroborating evidence. We have both, Frank said, but we also have people trying to kill us to keep this quiet. Your sister needs to understand that pursuing this story could put her in danger. David nodded slowly.
Sarah has faced threats before.
She knows how to protect herself and her sources. Give me 24 hours to contact her securely. If she agrees to meet with you, I'll arrange it. As they left the community center, Jake felt a mixture of hope and terror. They had taken the first step toward exposing the truth about his father's death. But they had also committed themselves to a course of action that would almost certainly result in retaliation from very dangerous people. Frank must have been thinking the same thing, because he stopped walking and turned to face Jake. Son, once we talk to that journalist, we're going to be marked for death. Are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this? Jake thought about his father, about the challenge coin in his pocket, and about the oath he had taken to protect his country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Frank, my father died trying to do the right thing. If I don't finish what he started, then his death really will have been meaningless. Frank smiled grimly. Then I guess we're both going to find out what your father would have done if he had lived long enough to see this through. 24 hours later, David Chen called Frank with news that would change everything. Sarah Chen had agreed to meet with them, but she wanted to see all the evidence first. More importantly, she had already begun her own investigation into the conspiracy and had uncovered additional information that connected the Vietnam-era corruption to present-day defense contracts worth billions of dollars. The meeting was arranged for Saturday evening at a small restaurant in downtown San Diego. Sarah had chosen the location carefully. It was crowded enough to provide cover, but quiet enough for serious conversation. Jake and Frank arrived separately, using different routes and checking repeatedly for surveillance. Sarah Chen was smaller than Jake had expected, but her reputation for fearless journalism was immediately apparent in her direct manner and penetrating questions. She had brought her own security expert, a former FBI agent named Rodriguez who specialized in protecting journalists investigating dangerous stories. Before we start, Sarah said, I need you both to understand that what you're describing isn't just historical corruption. The network you've uncovered has evolved over the decades. We're talking about a conspiracy that currently involves defense contractors, Pentagon officials, and elected representatives who are stealing billions of dollars from the American taxpayers. Jake felt his stomach clench with anxiety. The scope of what they were confronting was far larger than he had imagined. How is that possible? How could something this extensive operate without being detected? Rodriguez answered the question. Because the people involved have learned to hide their activities within legitimate government operations. They award contracts to companies they secretly own, approve weapons sales to allies who pay kickbacks, and bury their profits in offshore accounts that can't be traced. Sarah spread several documents across the table. They were financial records, intercepted communications, and photographs that painted a picture of systematic theft that had been ongoing for decades. The evidence you provided about your father's death was the missing piece that connected historical activities to current operations. Frank studied the documents with the careful attention of someone who had spent his life analyzing intelligence. These are the same people who killed Tommy Morrison. They've just gotten more sophisticated about hiding their crimes, and more ruthless about eliminating threats, Sarah added. Since I started investigating this story, 2 of my sources have died in apparent accidents, and a third has disappeared completely. Jake realized that by bringing the story to Sarah, they hadn't just gained a powerful ally. They had also painted a target on her back. Maybe we should reconsider this approach, he said. If they're willing to kill journalists, they're already trying to kill journalists, Rodriguez interrupted. The only way to stop them is to expose them completely all at once before they can react. Sarah explained her plan. She had been working with editors at the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal to coordinate simultaneous publication of the story. By releasing the information through multiple outlets at the same time, they could prevent the conspiracy from suppressing the story or intimidating individual journalists. We publish everything on Sunday morning, Sarah said. The full scope of the corruption, the historical cover-up, and the current criminal activities. By Monday morning, this will be the biggest political scandal in American history. But first, they needed one more piece of evidence. Sarah had learned that the conspirators were planning a major weapons sale to a foreign government that would generate massive illegal profits. The transaction was scheduled for Saturday night at a warehouse near the San Diego harbor. "We need photographic evidence of that meeting," Sarah explained. "Without it, they can claim that our historical documents are forgeries and our financial records are fabricated. But if we can prove they're actively engaged in illegal arms sales, the story becomes undeniable." Jake knew what she was asking. Someone would have to conduct surveillance on highly dangerous criminals who had already proven they were willing to commit murder. It was exactly the kind of mission his SEAL training had prepared him for, but it was also possibly a suicide mission. "I'll do it," Jake said without hesitation. "I have the training and equipment necessary for this kind of operation." Frank immediately protested. "Son, these people killed your father for discovering far less than what we're planning to expose. If they catch you photographing their weapons deal, they'll torture you for information about what else you know, then kill you." "Frank's right," Rodriguez added. "This isn't just about taking pictures. If something goes wrong, you'll be facing professional killers who have government resources at their disposal." Jake understood the risks, but he also understood something else. His father had died trying to expose these criminals, and now Jake had a chance to finish what his father had started. "This is what my father would have done," he said quietly. "This is what any good soldier would do when confronted with traitors." Sarah looked at Jake with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Are you absolutely certain about this? Once you take those photographs, there's no going back. These people will hunt you for the rest of your life." Jake pulled his father's challenge coin from his pocket and placed it on the table. "My father carried this coin on every dangerous mission in Vietnam. He died believing that some things are more important than personal safety. I believe the same thing." The next evening, Jake positioned himself on a rooftop overlooking the warehouse where the illegal weapons transaction was scheduled to take place. He had spent hours studying the location, identifying escape routes and potential hiding places. His equipment included night vision cameras, encrypted communication devices, and enough firepower to fight his way out if discovered. At exactly midnight, a convoy of black SUVs arrived at the warehouse. Jake began photographing immediately, capturing clear images of faces he recognized from Sarah's investigation. Several were current Pentagon officials. Others were executives from major defense contractors, and a few were foreign nationals who appeared to be representing the purchasing government. The weapons being sold were sophisticated military equipment that was supposed to be restricted for use by American forces only. Jake photographed shipping containers being opened to reveal advanced missile systems, encrypted communication equipment, and experimental weapons that weren't supposed to exist outside of classified research facilities. As Jake continued taking pictures, he noticed movement on another rooftop across the street. Someone else was conducting surveillance on the meeting, and they appeared to be using military-grade equipment. Jake realized with growing alarm that the warehouse might be under observation by multiple parties. His worst fears were confirmed when his communication device crackled with an encrypted message. "Overwatch to ground unit, we have visual confirmation of target. You are cleared to engage on my command." Jake was caught in the middle of what appeared to be a planned raid on the weapons meeting. If he was discovered by either the criminals or the raiding party, he would likely be killed as a potential witness. His only option was to complete his mission and escape before the raid began. Jake managed to photograph the entire transaction, including the exchange of briefcases that obviously contained payment for the weapons. As he prepared to leave his position, the raid began with explosive force. Federal agents stormed the warehouse from multiple directions, and a firefight erupted between the conspirators and their attackers. But something was wrong with the raid. Instead of arresting the criminals, the federal agents appeared to be executing them. Jake watched in horror as Pentagon officials and defense contractors were gunned down without being given a chance to surrender. This wasn't law enforcement. This was an assassination operation designed to eliminate witnesses. Jake realized with terrifying clarity what was happening. The conspiracy was cleaning house, eliminating the lower-level participants who might be forced to testify if arrested. The real leaders of the criminal network were using government resources to murder their own accomplices. As Jake escaped from the rooftop, he knew that his photographs had captured something far more significant than a simple weapons transaction. He had documented a mass murder conducted by the very people who were supposed to be investigating the conspiracy. Sunday morning arrived with newspaper headlines that shocked the world. Sarah Chen's coordinated publication had exposed decades of military corruption, but Jake's photographs provided proof that the conspiracy was still actively eliminating threats to its existence. Within hours of publication, congressional leaders were calling for emergency investigations, and several high-ranking government officials had resigned rather than face questioning. The conspiracy that had killed Jake was finally being exposed to the full light of public scrutiny. Frank called Jake that afternoon with news that brought their long journey full circle. "The FBI just arrested 3 men who were planning to assassinate us tonight," the old veteran said. "Turns out that publishing the story was the only thing that kept us alive. Now that everything is public, killing us would just confirm that Jake stood in his father's honor guard uniform, looking at the challenge coin that had started this entire investigation. His father's D